December 2023, Seaside Cove, Massachusetts. When Claire Thompson pushed open the door of the abandoned house she'd just bought for $1, the smell that hit her wasn't mildew or decay. It was something metallic, chemical, something that shouldn't exist in a basement that had been sealed for 4 years. The realtor had warned her about the reclusive veteran who died alone inside, about the rumors no one wanted to say out loud. But Claire was desperate. A widowed nurse with 2 sons and 30 days until homelessness, she didn't have the luxury of superstition. What she found behind a false wall in that flooded basement would either save her family or destroy everything she'd ever believed about right and wrong. Can you imagine discovering $55 million in stolen gold and having to choose between your children's future and your soul? This is a true story, and the decision Claire made that night will shock you until the very last second. The hospital parking lot was nearly empty when Claire Thompson clocked out at 11:47 p.m., her scrubs stained with bodily fluids she didn't want to identify, and her feet aching from a double shift that should have ended 6 hours ago. At 36 years old, she'd become both breadwinner and sole parent to her 2 sons, Mason and Tyler, after her husband David died in a construction accident 18 months ago, leaving behind medical bills that swallowed their savings and a mortgage she could no longer afford. The foreclosure notice had arrived 3 weeks ago, sealed in a manila envelope that seemed to pulse with malice when she opened it. 30 days to vacate, 30 days to find somewhere for her family to live on a nursing salary that barely covered groceries and gas. Claire had been raised to believe that hard work guaranteed security, that education and responsibility would shield you from disaster. But life had taught her a different lesson in the cruelest way possible. David's death had been instant, a scaffolding collapse that took him before the ambulance arrived, and the compensation from his employer had been swallowed by funeral costs and the predatory interest rates on emergency credit cards she'd used to keep them afloat. Now, driving through the quiet streets of Seaside Cove, a summer town on the Massachusetts coast that became a ghost town each winter, Claire felt the weight of her failures pressing against her chest. Mason, 13, and old enough to understand their situation, had stopped asking for things he needed. Tyler, only 9, still believed his mother could fix anything, a faith that both sustained and haunted her. The classified ad she'd circled in red ink sat on the passenger seat, crumpled from being read and reread a dozen times. House for sale, $1, waterfront location, as is, 843 Driftwood Lane. She'd called the number twice before finding the courage to make an appointment to see it. The realtor, a tired-sounding woman named Patricia Moss, had been blunt on the phone. It's been sitting empty for 4 years since the owner passed. The estate just wants it gone. Cash only, no inspections, you take it with whatever problems it has. Claire had $127 in her checking account, enough for the purchase price and maybe a week of groceries if she was careful. Driftwood Lane dead-ended at the ocean, a narrow street lined with vacation cottages that were boarded up for the season. Number 843 stood at the very end, a weathered Cape Cod-style house with gray shingles that had been battered by decades of salt air and winter storms. The roof sagged in the middle like a tired spine, and the windows were filmed with grime that turned them opaque. The yard was an explosion of beach grass and wild roses that had taken over completely, creating a barrier of thorns between the street and the front door. Patricia was waiting in her car, engine running for warmth against the November chill. She stepped out when Claire pulled up, pulling her coat tight against the wind that came off the lauder. "You're sure you want to see inside?" Patricia asked, her tone suggesting she'd shown this property to enough disappointed buyers to know how it usually ended. It's pretty rough. The previous owner, Walter Brennan, was a recluse, died alone in there, and by the time anyone found him, well, it's been sitting empty ever since. Claire looked at the house, seeing not what it was, but what it could become with enough work and determination. "I'm sure," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. The front door stuck, swollen from humidity and neglect, and Patricia had to put her shoulder into it before it gave way with a groan that sounded almost human. The smell hit them immediately, not decay exactly, but the thick mustiness of a space that had been sealed and forgotten, mixed with something else Claire couldn't quite identify. Chemical maybe, or mineral. The interior was frozen in time, furniture still in place under sheets that had yellowed with age, dishes in the sink, a calendar on the wall stopped at March 2019. Patricia moved through the rooms with the practiced efficiency of someone who wanted to finish quickly and leave. 2 bedrooms upstairs, 1 bath, living room, kitchen, and what used to be a dining room. Basement access through that door. She pointed to a narrow door off the kitchen that hung slightly askew on its hinges. Foundation is probably the only sound thing about this place, built on bedrock, which is why it's still standing. Claire climbed the narrow stairs, testing each step for weakness. The bedrooms were small, but received good light through the grimy windows, and she could already imagine Mason and Tyler claiming their spaces, painting the walls, hanging posters. "I'll take it," Claire heard herself say, the words surprising her even as they left her mouth. Patricia blinked, clearly not expecting such a quick decision. "You understand it's as is, right? No warranties, no guarantees. Whatever problems you find are yours to fix." "I understand," Claire replied, her mind already racing through calculations. With David's life insurance finally processed after 18 months of fighting with the company, she had about $8,000 that had arrived just last week. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make the house minimally habitable if she did most of the work herself. The closing happened 3 days later in a lawyer's office that smelled of old paper and furniture polish. Claire signed her name 27 times, handed over a single-dollar bill that the attorney photographed for the file, and walked out with a deed that felt both impossibly light and unbearably heavy. She'd committed herself to a house that might be unsalvageable, gambling her children's security on her ability to transform disaster into opportunity. That first night in the house was brutal. They had no electricity, no running water, and the November wind found every crack and gap in the old structure, making the whole building groan and shift like a ship at sea. Claire set up camp in the living room with sleeping bags she'd bought at a thrift store, a battery-powered lantern, and the determination that had carried her through David's death and everything that followed. Mason explored the house with a flashlight, his beam cutting through the darkness to illuminate corners and closets and the mysterious detritus of Walter Brennan's solitary life. Tyler stayed close to Claire, his small hand gripping her sleeve whenever the house made an unfamiliar sound. "It smells weird," Tyler whispered, his nose wrinkled against the pervasive mustiness. "It smells like possibility," Claire replied, trying to inject optimism she didn't quite feel. "Like a blank slate, we get to fill in however we want." "It smells like dead fish and old socks," Mason called from upstairs, his teenage literalism cutting through her attempted poetry. But despite his sarcasm, she could hear excitement in his voice, the first genuine interest he'd shown in anything since his father died. That first week was a crash course in survival-level home repair. Claire called in every favor she had, borrowing tools from David's former co-workers who showed up with unexpected generosity, bringing not just equipment but expertise. Jake Martinez, who'd worked alongside David for 15 years, spent an entire Saturday getting the electrical panel working well enough to provide power to half the house. "This wiring is from the 1950s, Jake muttered, shaking his head as he worked. "You're going to need to replace the whole system eventually, but this'll get you lights and heat for now." Claire watched him work, taking mental notes and asking questions, knowing she couldn't afford to hire professionals for everything that needed doing. The plumbing proved even more challenging. The pipes were a chaotic mixture of copper, galvanized steel, and what appeared to be actual lead in the oldest sections. Claire managed to get cold water running to the kitchen and bathroom, but hot water would require replacing the ancient water heater, an expense she couldn't yet afford. They heated water on a camping stove for washing, a primitive system that made Tyler complain and Mason roll his eyes, but it worked. By Thanksgiving, they had achieved a fragile domesticity. Power in most rooms, running water cold but functional, and enough space heaters to keep the bedrooms above freezing. Claire had scrubbed years of grime from the windows, letting pale November sunlight stream into spaces that had been dark for years. The boys had claimed their bedrooms, Mason taking the larger one that faced the street, Tyler choosing the smaller room with a view of the ocean. The house was slowly revealing itself to her, room by room, problem by problem. Water damage in the bathroom ceiling suggested roof issues she'd need to address before winter storms hit in earnest. The kitchen floor had a soft spot near the sink that meant rot in the subfloor. Every project revealed two more underneath, a Russian nesting doll of repairs that seemed to stretch infinitely ahead. But Claire had learned something about herself in the dark months after David's death. She was stronger than she'd ever imagined, capable of enduring hardships that would have broken the person she'd been before. This house, with all its problems, was still theirs. No landlord to answer to, no eviction notices waiting in the mailbox. The basement remained unexplored through those first weeks, a dark space she avoided because she had more urgent issues to address upstairs. But in early December, a heavy rainstorm revealed a new problem. Water began seeping up through the living room floor, creating dark stains on the old hardwood that spread like ink on paper. Claire opened the basement door, shining her flashlight down into darkness that seemed deeper than it should be. The stairs were slick with moisture, and she could hear water dripping somewhere below, a steady percussion that echoed off stone walls. "I'm going to check the basement," she called to Mason, who was doing homework at the kitchen table. "Stay up here with Tyler." Descending the stairs felt like entering another world, the temperature dropping noticeably with each step until Claire could see her breath in the flashlight beam. The basement was exactly as Patricia had described: stone walls that wept moisture, a dirt floor that had turned to mud in places, and an overwhelming smell of earth and decay. The space was larger than she'd expected, running the full length of the house, with ceiling joists so low she had to duck in places. Her flashlight beam swept across the stone walls, looking for obvious cracks or breaches that might explain the flooding. Instead, she noticed something odd about one section of the wall. The stones there looked different from the rest, darker, fit more tightly together, with mortar that appeared newer despite the basement's age. Claire moved closer, her sneakers squelching in the mud, examining the anomaly. The section was about 4 feet wide and extended from the floor to about shoulder height. When she pressed her hand against it, the stones shifted slightly, not much, but enough to suggest they weren't set as permanently as the rest of the foundation. Something about the newer wall section nagged at her, triggering instincts she'd developed as a nurse. When something looked out of place in a patient's chart, you investigated. When symptoms didn't match the obvious diagnosis, you dug deeper. This wall didn't match the rest of the basement, and that meant something. The next morning, a Saturday, Claire decided to investigate the basement wall properly. She'd found an old crowbar in the garage, rusted but functional, and borrowed a heavy-duty flashlight from Jake, who dropped by with a bag of groceries and hadn't asked questions about why she needed it. "I'm going to be downstairs for a while," she told the boys, "working on the flooding problem. Stay up here and yell if you need me." Mason glanced up from his phone, his expression skeptical. "You sure that's safe, going down there alone?" The question touched her, this glimpse of her son's protective instinct emerging through his teenage indifference. "I'll be careful," she promised, "but if I'm not back up in an hour, come check on me." The basement felt different in daylight, less ominous but more clearly derelict. Water still pooled in the low spots, and the smell of earth was even stronger than she remembered. Claire positioned her flashlight to illuminate the newer wall section and began testing the stones with her crowbar, looking for the weakest point. The mortar crumbled more easily than she expected, suggesting it was poorly mixed or had been exposed to moisture that degraded its integrity. Within 20 minutes, she'd loosened 3 stones enough to pull them free, creating a gap large enough to peer through. The smell that rushed out was overwhelming, not the sweet decay of organic matter, but something chemical and sharp that burned her nostrils. Claire pulled back, coughing, then forced herself to look through the opening she'd created. Her flashlight beam illuminated a space beyond the wall, a small room carved from the bedrock itself, maybe 8 feet deep and 6 feet wide. And filling that space, stacked floor to ceiling in organized rows, were metal containers. Claire's first thought was ammunition. The containers looked military in origin, olive drab with sealed lids and stenciled markings she couldn't read from this angle. But this mini container suggested something more than a veteran's keepsakes. She widened the opening, pulling away more stones until she could squeeze through into the hidden room. The containers were heavy, she discovered when she tried to lift one, far heavier than empty ammunition boxes should be. She set it down carefully and worked at the latched lid until it popped open with a metallic click that echoed in the small space. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, were bars of gold. Not coins or jewelry, but raw ingots stamped with assay marks and serial numbers. Claire's hands shook as she unwrapped one completely, feeling the weight of it, the unmistakable density of pure gold. Her nurse's brain tried to process what she was seeing, while her mother's brain screamed at the implications. This wasn't treasure found by accident. This wasn't an inheritance or collection. This amount of gold, hidden behind a false wall in a basement, represented something illegal, very illegal. Claire opened another container, then another. All gold in various forms, bars, nuggets, even what looked like raw ore still embedded in quartz. Dozens of containers, maybe 40 or more, each weighing 30 or 40 pounds. She tried to calculate the value and stopped when the numbers became too large to comprehend. Millions, certainly. Tens of millions, possibly. Enough to solve every problem her family faced and create entirely new ones. Quick question before we continue, and I need your honest answer. If you discovered $55 million in stolen gold in your basement, would you report it immediately, or would you be tempted to keep at least some of it to save your struggling family? Think about it for a second. Really think about what you do. Drop your answer in the comments because this decision is about to change everything for Claire. And if you're not subscribed yet, hit that button now because this story is about to take a turn that'll leave you speechless. She climbed back through the opening in the wall, her legs shaking, and sat on the basement stairs trying to slow her racing heart. The smart thing, the legal thing was obvious. Call the police, report the find, let authorities sort out where the gold came from and who it belonged to. But the practical thing, the desperate thing, whispered different advice. She'd bought the house for $1, as is, with everything inside it. Legally, didn't that make the gold hers? Even as she thought it, she knew the rationalization was flimsy. Hidden gold meant stolen gold, and stolen property remained stolen no matter who found it. Claire sat in the darkness of her basement, the weight of her discovery pressing down like a physical thing, and faced a choice that would define everything that came after. Report it and remain poor but honest, or keep it and become something she'd never been before, a thief. That night, after the boys were asleep, Claire returned to the basement alone. She'd made her decision, or rather, desperation had made it for her. She would keep the gold, at least for now. She would find a way to slowly, carefully convert it into the resources her family desperately needed. And she would live with whatever consequences followed. Over the next 3 weeks, working only while the boys were at school, Claire moved the containers one at a time to a storage facility she rented under a false name in the next county. The work was backbreaking, each container weighing between 35 and 50 pounds, but her years as a nurse had given her more strength than most people assumed. She was meticulous about leaving no evidence, resealing the wall section perfectly, and removing any traces of her activities. Before she sealed it completely, Claire removed 3 of the smaller gold bars, wrapping them carefully in old towels and hiding them in a locked toolbox in the garage. She'd need to research how to sell gold without triggering suspicion, how to convert illegal assets into legitimate currency. Over the following weeks, Claire became 2 people. By day, she was a dedicated nurse and struggling single mother, working her shifts at the hospital and renovating her house room by room. By night, she was a criminal researcher, studying gold markets and money laundering and the ways people converted stolen assets into clean money. The internet was both helpful and horrifying, filled with stories of people caught trying to sell suspicious gold, of federal investigations and asset seizures, and prison sentences that made her stomach churn. On Christmas Eve, Claire sold her first piece of gold. She'd driven 2 hours to Portland, finding a jewelry buyer who specialized in estate sales and scrap gold. Her story was simple. She'd inherited some old jewelry from her late husband's grandmother, pieces she couldn't bear to wear but needed to sell for practical reasons. The buyer, a middle-aged man with kind eyes and no apparent suspicion, examined the small gold bar she'd carefully filed down to look less industrial. "It's been melted down from something else," he observed, turning it under his jeweler's loupe. "Probably old jewelry that was consolidated. I can give you $900 for it." $900. Not enough to change their lives, but enough to buy real Christmas presents for the boys, to stock the refrigerator, to make a dent in the property taxes that would come due in January. Claire took the cash and drove home with her hands shaking on the steering wheel, crossing a line she could never uncross. Over the following months, Claire established a careful pattern. Every 4 to 6 weeks, she'd make a trip to a different city: Portland, Boston, Providence, Hartford. Never the same buyer twice, never with pieces large enough to trigger serious questions. She created stories about inherited jewelry, old coins discovered in attic boxes, family heirlooms she was reluctantly selling to fund home repairs. The cash accumulated slowly but steadily, hidden in various places throughout the house. Behind loose boards in the closet, inside a false bottom she'd installed in a kitchen drawer, sealed in plastic bags and buried in the crawl space. The house transformation accelerated with the influx of money. Claire hired professionals for the job she couldn't do herself. The electrical system was completely rewired, new plumbing installed throughout, the roof replaced with proper waterproofing. She framed each improvement as the result of careful budgeting and doing much of the work herself, which was partly true. By spring, 843 Driftwood Lane looked like a different house. Fresh paint covered the weathered shingles. New windows let light flood into rooms that had been dark for years. The yard was tamed into something approaching civilized. Neighbors who'd driven past the derelict property for years began stopping to compliment Claire on the transformation. Mason watched these exchanges with increasing suspicion. At 14, he'd developed a teenager's finely tuned detector for inconsistencies, and something about their situation wasn't adding up. One evening after Tyler had gone to bed, he confronted Claire directly. "Where's the money coming from?" Mason asked without preamble, his arms crossed in a posture that reminded her achingly of David. "For all the new stuff, the repairs, everything. Your salary doesn't cover this." Claire had prepared for this conversation, but rehearsing lies didn't make them easier to deliver. "I got a settlement from Dad's accident," she said, which was technically true, though the settlement had been modest and spent months ago. "And I've been picking up extra shifts, doing some consulting work online." Mason's eyes narrowed. "What kind of consulting? You're an ER nurse." The skepticism in his voice was justified. She was cornered by her own son's intelligence and the flimsy nature of her cover story. "Medical coding," she improvised. "It's boring data entry stuff, but it pays well, and I can do it from home." The lie hung between them, obvious and uncomfortable. Mason stared at her for a long moment, and Claire could see him weighing whether to push harder or let it go. Finally, he shook his head. "I don't believe you, but I don't know what you're actually doing. I just hope it's not something that's going to blow up on us." The conversation haunted Claire for days afterward. She'd crossed another line, lying directly to her son, and the distance it created between them felt like punishment. In June, 7 months after discovering the gold, Claire received an unexpected visit from a local detective named Sarah Walsh. The officer appeared at her door on a warm Saturday morning, badge visible on her belt, expression professionally neutral. "Mrs. Thompson, I'm Detective Walsh with Seaside Cove PD. I'm investigating some irregularities related to the previous owner of your property. Do you have a few minutes to talk?" Claire's heart stopped, but her nurse's training kicked in, maintaining her composure in crisis. "Of course, come in. Is there a problem?" Detective Walsh entered, her eyes sweeping the renovated interior with obvious appreciation. "You've done a lot of work on a place. The previous owner, Walter Brennan, was quite a character. A recluse, kept to himself. When he died, it took 3 weeks for anyone to notice." Claire led her to the kitchen table, offering coffee that the detective accepted. "I didn't know Mr. Brennan. I bought the house from his estate. Is there something specific you're investigating?" Walsh pulled out a notebook, flipping to a marked page. "Mr. Brennan served in Vietnam, but what's more interesting is his career afterward. He worked as a security guard for a precious metals company in the 1980s. There was an incident in 1986, a robbery, where several $1 million worth of gold bullion went missing from a transport. Brennan was questioned at the time, but never charged. The room felt suddenly airless." Claire fought to keep her expression curious rather than guilty. "That's terrible, but I'm not sure how it relates to me." "The case was never solved," Walsh continued, watching Claire's face. "The gold was never recovered, and Brennan died alone in this house with no living relatives. The thing is, I've been reviewing old case files, and something about Brennan's financial situation after that robbery doesn't quite add up. He retired early, lived comfortably despite no obvious income source, paid cash for this property." Claire's mouth was dry, but she forced herself to sip her coffee calmly. "That's interesting history, but I'm still not clear on why you're here." "Look, Mrs. Thompson, I'm not accusing you of anything. I'm just following up on a very old case that likely won't go anywhere. If you happen to find anything unusual while renovating, any documents, old belongings that might shed light on Brennan's activities, I'd appreciate a call. Sometimes these old houses hold secrets." The irony of that statement wasn't lost on Claire. She walked Walsh to the door, promising to call if she discovered anything relevant, knowing she never would. After the detective left, Claire sat at her kitchen table, hands shaking with delayed reaction. The walls were closing in. Law enforcement was asking questions, connecting dots, investigating the dead man whose gold she'd been stealing for 7 months. The smart thing would be to stop now, to seal the basement wall permanently, and be grateful for what she'd already taken. But Claire had done the math. She'd converted roughly a third of the gold, maybe $15 million worth at current market prices, and still had 2/3 remaining. That night, Claire made a decision that terrified her. She would contact Detective Walsh and offer a deal, not a confession, but carefully calculated cooperation. The next morning, Claire called the detective. "I've been thinking about our conversation, and there's something I need to show you. In my basement. But first, I need to know, if someone found something that didn't belong to them but could help close an old case, what kind of arrangement could be made?" Walsh's voice sharpened with interest. "That depends entirely on what we're talking about and how forthcoming the person is willing to be. Hypothetically, cooperation is always viewed more favorably than obstruction." The meeting happened that afternoon. Claire led Detective Walsh to the basement, to the resealed wall section, and told a carefully crafted version of the truth. She'd discovered a hidden chamber, she'd found gold, and she'd panicked. She'd taken some to sell because she was desperate, but the majority remained untouched. She wanted to return it in exchange for immunity from prosecution. Walsh's reaction was measured. "How much gold are we talking about?" Claire had prepared for this question. Approximately 40 containers. Based on what I researched, maybe $55 million worth. The detective's expression remained neutral, but Claire saw the flash of surprise in her eyes. "And how much did you take?" "About a third, maybe 15 million. I've spent some on the house, invested the rest. I can return all of it, the gold that's left, and the money I made from selling the rest." The negotiation took weeks. Federal prosecutors got involved, the FBI reopened the 1986 case, and Claire's life became a series of depositions, interviews, and legal consultations. The deal she eventually secured was better than she dared hope. Full immunity in exchange for returning all the gold and the proceeds from what she'd sold, plus her cooperation in documenting how Brennan had likely hidden the stolen property. The gold was recovered, returned to the insurance company that had covered the original theft. Claire had to give back every penny she'd made, which meant selling the house and most of the improvements she'd paid for. But she walked away without criminal charges, without a record, and with something more valuable than gold, her integrity restored and her relationship with her sons intact. Mason had been the hardest to face after the truth came out. The disappointment in his eyes cut deeper than any legal consequence could have. But over time, as he watched his mother cooperate fully with authorities, accept responsibility for her choices, and work to make things right, something shifted. "You made a mistake," he told her one evening as they packed boxes to move to a small rental apartment. "But you fixed it. That takes courage too." Claire never forgot the lesson that $55 million in gold had taught her. Some treasures come with costs too high to pay, and the most valuable things in life, trust, integrity, the love of your children, can't be bought or replaced once they're lost. She rebuilt her life slowly, renewed her nursing license, found a modest apartment where the boys could have their own rooms, and every night she looked at her sons and knew she'd made the right choice in the end. The compass she'd capped from an old friend who tried to warn her about losing her way now sat on her nightstand, its needle still pointing true north. Some paths lead away from where we should be, but a reliable compass always shows us the way back home. And Claire had finally found her way back, not to wealth or security, but to something far more precious, the ability to look her children in the eyes and know they could trust her again. That, she'd learned, was worth more than all the gold in the world.